Civic Engagement Program. Thank you for joining us. My name is Enola Aird, and our topic for this evening is the paperback principle, yesterday and today. We're talking with Dr. Audrey Kerr, professor at Southern Connecticut State University, about her book, The Paperback Principle, Class, Colorism, and Rumor, and the Case of Black Washington, D.C. It is a fascinating book about the ways in which the lie of black inferiority has been passed down through the generations in the black community. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Certainly looking forward to it. You have put together quite a treasure trove of information and lore about a topic that doesn't get discussed too much, but it's really quite important in the black community. Tell us, what is the paperback principle?
The purpose of the book initially was to think about and have an opportunity to write about an entire area of lore in black community that had really not been committed to paper. So I was primarily interested in the idea that there were all of these folk forms that existed, including legends, myths, tall tales, urban legends, blues music, that memorialized in many different ways the importance of complexion in black community. But because these forms were all oral, they were going to fade away. There was no repository. There was nowhere you could go to mine through this material. And so the creation of this book was really an effort to find a way to capture this historical material on the page, and also to use the material to do some type of study of how complexion has really mattered in black life, both internally, but also the external forces that created the preoccupation with color. So
what is the paper? I noticed that the book cover has a paper bag.
Yeah.
What is it? What is?
So the paper bag principle was a piece of lore that I had heard growing up in a lot of different circles, and it was this piece of urban legend that essentially said that in order to join certain fraternities, sororities, social groups, in some cases churches, institutions, organizations, you had to be lighter than the color of a brown paper bag. And this particular urban legend was something that replicated itself in different American cities. And many black people believed it to be true. There were some places where it had greater currency than others. In New Orleans, for example, there actually were paper bag parties where people had to be a certain complexion to attend those parties. In other places, it was just the idea that you were not welcomed in certain social circles or with a certain social group. And it's a sort of taboo subject in black community. So I felt that the naming of the book, The Paper Bag Principle, would speak to the fact that this isn't about whether or not a paper bag existed. It's about the theory behind it, and it's about the belief system that it perpetuated over several generations.
Do most black people know about the paper bag test, or paper bag principle?
Most black people know about the idea of it if they don't know about the language of it. I mean, they might not be familiar with that phrase, but they're certainly familiar with the notion of exclusive organizations, or organizations that are thought to exclude people who are darker. But I was surprised, particularly in the context of college, for example, and I went to a predominantly white college, that most of the black students on this white college campus were very familiar with the notion of a paper bag test. And later, when I went to Washington, D.C. to do research, I was at Howard University, and I could hardly stumble upon a person who had not heard of the paper bag principle. But the space between the existence of actual practices and a whole body of material that enforced a way of being, that's what the paper bag principle is. It's the notion that there's this idea that people are excluded, whether or not the practices actually take place.
I want to step back for a minute and ask you, what drew you to this idea? I understand from reading the book that your grandmother had something to do with this.
My grandmother had a little bit to do with it. My grandmother was a very fair-skinned West Indian woman who, in my understanding of her experience, was able to have a really great transition into the American dream, in part because she was near white, and that she recognized that in America, her fair skin was a passport to opportunities that many of her black friends who were American didn't have. And my grandmother, I think, in our being around her home, she also enforced for us that there were certain notions of marrying up, and marrying up meant marrying someone lighter than your own color, and that each generation we were improving ourselves by doing this. And this wasn't something that she always spoke explicitly, but it was implicit. And it was implicit in the way she talked about certain people, the way she might talk about someone as having made a poor decision, for example, in selecting their spouse. Not so much, I mean, I never heard that from my parents. It really was my grandmother's generation.
And you say that she was from Jamaica, and you know, this book is obviously focused primarily on the African American community.
Right.
But what is your sense about the applicability of this principle, these ideas, outside of the United States?
You know, one of the things that captured my interest as I was working on this book was doing a fellowship in Indian religion and philosophy at the University of Hawaii, and becoming more familiar with the extent to which Indian social norms were very much governed by, and the caste system was very much governed by notions of what it meant to be light or dark skin, and living in a society where you were really fixed in your place. So because it's a primarily Hindu culture, and because there is this overriding belief that whatever your caste in life, it's what you have certainly earned as a result of your past life, then you didn't really fight your way out of your position because it's where you were supposed to be. And that was very similar to how things functioned in New Orleans, which actually had a formal caste system. And so people were usually poorer and darker and richer and lighter. In India, you see the same thing in Brazil to this day, where access to power and opportunity seems to be granted at a greater rate to people who are fairer in complexion, and you certainly see it in the West Indies. So I think that there is probably no place you can go where there isn't no place where there are people of color anyway, where there isn't a direct correlation between complexion and opportunity. And so to the extent that this is a historical truism, it seemed to me that it was worth some explanation beyond racism, of understanding how the dynamic of racial issues were being perpetuated internally, and what mechanisms had been formed by people of color in order to recreate racist principles over and over again.
So you start the book, and for several chapters talk about something called complexion lore.
Yes.
And so I'm interested in what that is, and sort of how it manifests itself, and what are some of your most vivid examples of what that might be?
One of the things that I felt a great commitment to in this process was trying to figure out how to make this material not go away permanently. And a body of stories that you see, for example, that talk very richly about the importance of complexion to Black community are creation stories. So creation stories often have to do with how Black people became Black. And the story often has to do with something like one person fell asleep in the sun, and you know, God told everyone to be back at 9 o'clock, and they fell asleep in the sun, and they didn't get back on time, and so their skin got burnt, except for their hands, which were pressed down. And what's interesting about this lore to me is that on one level, it perpetuates an existing stereotype of Black bodies as lazy, as disinterested, as not easily engageable even by God. But on the other hand, all of the storytellers, if they are Black, are granting some type of agency to Black bodies to kind of choose their own fate. And so it's a double-edged sword. There are two ways you can. But all of the stories seem to suggest that Blackness is in some way a punishment for a particular behavior. And so I wanted to analyze these creation stories beyond just sort of...
And where do the creation stories come from?
So a lot of them are, you can find a lot of them in very old Uncle Remus tales, for example. Most of them have existed before the start of the the 20th century. And in a lot of cases, these are stories that would have been told on slave plantations. If you look at some of the collections of stories from ex-slaves, or Weevils in the Wheat, for example, you'll see a lot of these creation stories, Uncle Remus tales, which are obviously not collected by or necessarily told by Black people. And so that was just one body of lore, but you can also look at blues lyrics, for example, which are always memorializing, I left my dark-skinned woman, you know, for a light-skinned gal, and she was no good, you know. I'm going to go back to the safety of my dark-skinned woman, and which is always implying in some way or another that the woman who nobody else desires is the safety place. And you see this in urban legends, and you see it in folk tales and jump rope rhymes. And so it just seemed to be persistent in every form of lore I visited. So that was what I wanted to get down, and also in literature, mostly early literature by African Americans, but also literature by whites that talked about things like tests, you know, that existed, fingernail tests, ways to test people into or out of Blackness. All of these, to me, were the oral forms that I wanted to find a way to get onto paper.
You've got some really interesting pictures, images here that we thought we would share.
Yeah.
Can you kind of guide us through some of what you've got in there?
So, for example, I selected this one because this one was actually before the turn of the century. This is an 1895 drawing of an African-American woman, and it attempts to demonstrate the way that she straightens her hair. And what it suggests is that in order to straighten her hair, she had to read what they call a hair-raising ghost story, and it goes through the various steps. And this is one piece that obviously would be considered clearly offensive today, but it's a very good, I think, illustration of the way in which a lot of the oppressions are working in tandem. So you can't talk about complexion without also talking about the importance of things like hair texture, phenotype, and other indicators of Blackness or whiteness.
I think this is so important because we tend to have this sort of image of racism. You know, it's this big concept out there, a system oppressing us or certain people. But what's fascinating about this, it feels to me like this lore, these myths, these ads or whatever, cartoons, are ways of internalizing, of bringing into the community, bringing into its bloodstream this notion of Black inferiority, of making it a permanent part of the people.
Yes. You know, one of the things I stumbled upon that I found fascinating was that there are all different types of tests, but the first tests were perpetuated by whites, but the second set of tests were perpetuated by Blacks. And so, for example, you had some white institutions like the Hex Company in Washington, D.C. They would hire people called spotters who were there to identify Blacks who were attempting to pass into, or the National Theater hired spotters attempting to catch people trying to pass into white institutions. And so, in a sense, whiteness was a protected category. But then you also had Black folks who would then perpetuate the same type of behaviors in the Black community. And so racism was something that was learned by Black folks, and it was replicated because proximity to whiteness was proximity to power. And so as Black folks found that they were on the brink of having access to some power, darker-skinned people then threatened their access to white opportunity. And so I always say that it is not possible at all to talk about colorism, to talk about the internal dialogue of colorism and behavior related to colorism without talking about racism as being at the root cause of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to show some more?
So this second one, which my students actually still find fascinating, these are both products that were marketed in popular magazines. Half Century was one of the more popular magazines among African Americans in the early 1900s, and this was an advertisement for a hair grower. and it was a product that was believed to miraculously allow black women's hair to grow. And you can see this is actually, it looks like a picture of an Indian woman.
What does it say? Yeah,
it says, the wonder of the age. Your hair will be long, soft, and beautiful if you use Madam C.J. Hart's hair grower. Restores strength and vitality to your hair. And what's so interesting about this to me is that, you know, the advertisements really never select a black woman as a representation of beauty. I mean, you can look through 100 advertisements and you won't find a single one. And many of them actually show black women with a spouse or partner. All of them seem to strongly suggest if you want a husband, then it would be in your best interest to either lighten your skin or lengthen your hair. And then if you look at the bottom advertisement, it actually shows a split, kind of a split screen of a woman, one before and one after she lightens her skin. This is the same Palmer, actually, family that puts out Palmer products today. Right. And it says Dr. Fred Palmer's Skin Whitener. And then on the other, and this is a product that actually still exists today as well. You see a series of women, Enola, you see a series of women, it says bleach your skin to lighter, lovelier beauty. And of course, they've cleaned up some of the language of that, but Enola still makes claims to improve your skin.
Brighten your skin.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to point out at this point, or?
Well, you know, some of the other pictures that I selected, I mean, one of the obstacles in doing this research ethnographically is that you contact people through a number of different means and ask them to participate, and everyone says, well, I can't participate, I can't help you because this didn't exist. It's not real, it never happened. And so I was really interested in looking through a lot of the archival pictures in Washington, D.C. That showed evidence of what social groups really did look like. This particular one is